110. It's 110. That sounds good to me. 110. We'll try to be on time. We're just so sorry about those who are standing up. We're going to see whether, in fact, we stay in this room. It's something I like about this room, though, but we'll see because there's no way we can have the precious students standing up, especially as you're wrestling with how to live your life. I mean, it's hard to just do that on your feet all the time. And so we'll have to see. We'll wait for next week. You think is that the best thing to do? We'll wait for next week. What we plan to do today is just welcome you to the class, The Conduct of Life. And it's true, we're going to be wrestling with some of the most terrifying and frightening queries that you can pose to yourself, that we can pose to ourselves, which is why live and how to live. What is the good life? What is the wise life? What is the courageous life? We'll be looking at a variety of classical and canonical sources. We're unable to dig deep into a variety of different great civilizations and cultures, but we're going to highlight certain ones. And we're always open to your voices and views and visions in terms of the various traditions you may bring that's not necessarily reflected on the syllabus itself. But I just want to begin by saying I am always overjoyed to be in conversation with my dear brother, Roberto Unger. That it has been now almost 40 years when I sat where you now sit, when he was lecturing. And in those days, he used to walk from one side of the room to the other, back and forth. And people would be following the words, not because he was all wise, but because he was highly wise. And you can imagine, he was in 25 years old when he first got, well, I think he's 10 to 24, but I didn't see him until he was 25. He's slightly older now, but even more wise. He is an intellectual giant. And to have him in our midst is actually quite a blessing. I think it's the kind of thing you will recall as you move closer to the grave. And it's at the end and aim of the class, of course, is to make sure that you leave each week so thoroughly unsettled and unnerved and unhoused. Is that Brother Mark there? Mark Jefferson, should you could be up here teaching the class with us, brother. It's a blessing to see you, towering intellectual, gifted literary artist. But let's begin on first a historic note. 160 years ago yesterday, the greatest literary artist of late modernity, Anton Chekhov, was born in Taganrog, Russia. And as a literary artist, obsessed with trying to generate conditions under which we can endure and persevere, wrestling with catastrophe in various forms. Psychic, social, civic, not just in the Russian context, but in any context where human beings find themselves wrestling with death, dread, despair, disappointment, disillusionment, and disenchantment. So it's almost providential that we would begin with this moment given 166 years ago, who came forth. What we try to do in this class is to provide both our own individual takes, and of course we're fallible like anybody else, to encourage you to no longer in any way be echoes of the silo from which you come, an echo from the family or tradition or community from which you come, but to find your voice, just like a jazz musician or a blues woman. To find your voice in wrestling with the kind of life you will lead as both a certain kind of person, self, individual, in relation to community, in relation to solidarity, connection, in relation to a certain kind of connection. So today what we're going to do is Brother Unger is going to begin providing us with an overall reflection. I'm going to add and respond to his reflection with my overall framework and reflection. He and I will go at it, and we have a good time going at it. So don't get nervous if it looks like sometimes we're not as friendly as we really are. No, I'm just kidding. We have a wonderful time together. And then, of course, we'll open it up to you today. So I'll pass it over to you, my brother.
So this is a course about the only question that no one can escape, which is how should I live my life? No one can not answer that question, because if they fail to answer it explicitly, they will nevertheless answer it implicitly by the way in which they do live. Let me be clear about what this course is not. So, first, it is not a survey of the history of philosophy or of religion or of different moral views. It has a particular agenda that I shall speak to today and that is laid out in the syllabus. Second, it is not what passes for moral philosophy in most of the philosophy departments of the Anglo-American world today. The main object in professional moral philosophy is what you might label meta-ethics. It addresses the choice of a method, a higher order method, which supposedly allows us to specify our obligations to one another. And its predominant temper is the temper of a kind of moral legalism. The underlying view of the moral life is that it is a kind of book of accounts, of debits and credits, and the objective is to reach the end of our lives blameless, with our hands as clean as were the hands of Pontius Pilate after he washed them. So this is not the perspective from which we engage.
That's nice.
Because our starting point is not this moral legalism, and because our concern is the first order concern with the conduct of life, rather than the specification of a conceptual contraption that supposedly allows us to define our obligations to one another. And third, the course is not an attempt to provide solace, to tell a series of feel-good stories. And much of the history of philosophy and of religion consists in a sequence of such feel-good stories. We face irreparable flaws in the human condition. Our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. And much of the effort in philosophy and theology or religion has been somehow to show that these incurable defects in the human situation are not really there, or that we have some easy fix on them. One way of understanding the classical conception of philosophy in the West is that it consisted in the idea of a kind of super science, above the discipline, describing the ultimate nature of reality and providing a basis for self-help. The self-help against these irreparable flaws of mortality, groundlessness, and insatiability. Well, that's not what we're going to try to do here. And part of the discussion regards how we can dispense with this impulse to cast a spell on ourselves and address the conduct of life free from the bounds of illusion and wishful thinking. Now I want to make three sets of remarks. The first set of remarks concerns the intellectual space in which we attempt this inquiry, the kind of discourse that it is. The second set of remarks has to do with the historical background in the spiritual evolution of humanity. And the third set of remarks is about our central focus in this attempt. So first, the intellectual space. The broad space of an open frontier between philosophy and religion. A space with the following characteristics. The first attribute of views in this space is that they ground an orientation to existence, an approach to the conduct of life, in a vision of our situation in the world. The existential imperative is anchored in a conception of our condition. And this anchoring of the approach to the conduct of life in a vision of our condition crosses the divide between the is and the ought, between empirical or descriptive views and normative or prescriptive views. Now, there is a famous doctrine in the history of Western philosophy, and the classical place in which it was formulated was a work of David Hume's. It says that it is fallacious to jump from the is and the ought. But in Hume's own masterwork, the Treatise on Human Nature, a vision of how to live is grounded in a conception of who we are and of our place in the world. So it seems that this distinction between the is and the ought applies only to, as it were, local propositions or reasonings. The more comprehensive our views become, our views about ourselves and about what to do, the more this distinction between the is and the ought tends to be subverted. The second characteristic of the ideas that we will engage with in this intellectual space is that they all have to do with these basic flaws in the human condition. That we will die, despite our experience of the infinite or indefinite fecundity of vision, of invention, of ingenuity, of connection. That we are groundless and unable to establish the ultimate framework of reality and of our existence, with the result that our lives have a dreamlike and vertiginous character, and that we are insatiable, demanding the infinite, the unlimited, from all the finite things and experiences that surround us. So, before the spiritual revolutions that resulted in the world religions of today, the focus of religion was on the powers and terrors of nature. And then it changed. It changed to our engagement with these irreparable flaws in the human condition. The third characteristic of views in this intellectual space is that their impulse is to penetrate the whole of existence, private and public. They cannot be cabined in any particular sphere of life. Now, there are certain exceptions to that in the history of philosophy and of religion. For example, in the middle period of the history of Protestantism, where there was a tendency to understand religious experience as private, the privatization of the sublime. But even in the history of Protestantism, that tendency is incompatible with early Protestantism, the Protestantism of Luther or Calvin, or contemporary Protestantism. It is an exception. It is a deviation from the demand of the religious imagination and the philosophy as it extends religion to penetrate all of our experience and not just part of it. Now, the fourth characteristic of views in this intellectual space, and a characteristic that will prove yes, and a characteristic that will prove especially troubling in our discussions, is what you might describe as the cognitive gap. These arguments and doctrines have to do with the most weighty decision that we can make, which is how to live, what to do with our lives. And we can have reasons for taking one or another position with respect to that question. However, the reasons always seem to be inconclusive. It's not that we can't argue and cannot adduce grounds to follow one direction or another. It's that there never seems to be closure. There is then a disproportion between the weight of the decision or the commitment and the adequacy of the grounds that we can invoke in favor of it. And this disproportion is what I'm calling the cognitive gap. It can sometimes be described under the label of faith. So we have to act in the end, decide, commit, without what seem to be sufficient grounds. And that's what we might describe as faith. And that need to make the inadequately grounded commitment then also elicits the need for faith or trust in a second sense. As we act on the basis of these inadequately grounded commitments, we become more vulnerable to others. And this heightened vulnerability is one of the conditions for serious action in the world. We become more vulnerable, and therefore the need for faith in a second sense. Now I come to my second set of remarks about the historical background. In the period from the rise of prophetic Judaism to the prophetic activity of Muhammad, a series of spiritual innovations or revolutions took place in the history of humanity that produced the world religions of today. And they included, along the way, visions, approaches to the conduct of life and to the nature of our situation that are very different from those that were established by the Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They included, for example, Buddhism on one side, and its background in the religion or philosophy of the Vedas in ancient India, and Confucianism on the other side. There is in the history of religion the idea of a so-called axial age that was formulated by the philosopher Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher after the Second World War, and that was presaged by the writings of Max Weber in his comparative sociology of religion. And that was a somewhat sectarian understanding of these religions, of these religious revolutions, in which the main focus was to suggest an affinity between ancient Greek philosophy and Jerusalem, the Semitic monotheisms, as if the party of enlightenment in the West were looking for adequate ancestors to itself. We're not taking that view of these revolutions, we're taking a broader view. And we can then ask, what did they have in common these world religions that arose during this 1,000-year period, despite the immense differences among them. First, they had in common a desanctification of nature. Nature ceased to be regarded as divine. And the idea that the divine, the ultimate source of reality and of value, exceeds the natural world. And this is then the idea of transcendence and of a dialectic between transcendence and immanence. The ultimate source of reality and value goes beyond the natural world, but then returns to the natural world, to our human experience in some form, its immanence. And this relation between the transcendence of the ultimate and its immanence became central to all of the religions that arose in this 1,000-year period. The second common characteristic is that they all focused on what I called a moment ago the irreparable flaws in the human condition. Rather than on our dependence on nature, which had been the previous focus of the religious imagination. And they all took a position about it. Often the position was to say that those flaws were not really there. The third common characteristic is that they claimed that the divisions within humanity of class, of caste, of gender were all shallow and failed to reach the bedrock. We are united at the most fundamental level according to these religions. Now there's a question. Is this just a redescription of reality? Or is it a command to change the existing reality? Are the slave owner and the slave already united, despite the appearance of their disunion? Or can their union be achieved only by some transformation, the abolition of slavery, the establishment of free labor? The fourth common characteristic of these religions that arose in that period was that they advocated a radical transformation in the way to live, in the ethical ideal. The predominant ethic before in many of the great agrarian bureaucratic empires that were the main protagonists in world history was the ethic associated with the fighters. It was the ethic of proud self-assertion, of vengeance, of valor. And this ethic was repudiated in favor of an ethic of universalistic altruism, of inclusive fellow feeling by all of these religions. And that is an astonishing event in the history of humanity. How it is that a moral view so radically in contradiction with common experience then and even common experience now, could have been embraced by such a large part of mankind. The fifth common characteristic of these religions is that they all offered mankind, as it were, a two-sided ticket. They all had an ambiguity. One side of the ticket was an invitation to escape from the world as it is, into some higher reality. without necessarily confronting the present organization of the world. And then we could, as it were, sing in our chains. The other side of the ticket was a command to transform the existing world. So there's always this ambiguity in these religions between redescription and transformation. Now that's then the great historical background that produced what has remained, at least until very recently, the spiritual horizon of the human race. But I now want to relate it to a second set of revolutions, which is the immediate context of our argument. For the last 200 or 300 years, there has been a revolutionary project in the world. And this revolutionary project has put the whole world on fire. It has two sides, a political side and a personalist side. The political side is carried by the doctrines of democracy, liberalism, socialism, promising to rescue all nations from entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy. And the personalist side has been sustained by the Romantic movement and the worldwide popular Romantic culture, with its message that the ordinary man and woman are not so ordinary after all, that they share in the attributes of divinity, especially the attribute of transcendence over the particular circumstance, and that they can increase their quota in this divine attribute. That's the revolutionary project. And it has commanded for a long time the agenda of humanity. It has enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. And in that sense, it commands the agenda. Now, however, it is in the paradoxical position of being both strong and weak. It is strong because it continues to be the defining agenda, but it is weak because its adepts, its votaries, no longer know what its next steps should be, either on the political side or on the personalist moral side. And the law of the Spirit is that we can possess only what we renounce and reinvent. So this project, despite its real and apparent strength, is now disoriented. And it is in that context that this argument occurs. Now, there's a connection between the earlier spiritual revolutions and this recent spiritual and political revolution in the history of mankind. And we can see that connection in different ways in the different religions and philosophies. For example, Christianity. There are two central ideas in Christianity. One is the idea of the infinite. We participate in the divine. The other is the idea of the primacy of love rather than of altruism in the organization of our moral experience. And somehow these two ideas are intimately connected, the idea of the infinite and the idea of the primacy of love in the Christian imagination. And the question is, what are the implications of this for the reshaping of our experience, our social experience in the organization of society, and our personal experience in the conduct of our lives? And that is, as it were, a bridge, the search for that connection between the earlier revolutions and this disoriented, bogged down revolutionary project of the last 200 or 300 years. Now I make my third set of remarks about a central focus, or one of the focal points of our arguments here in the course. We can distinguish between ethics, moral visions, approaches to the conduct of life that are secular, in the sense that they dispense with metaphysical or theological presuppositions, and approaches that envelop this commitment to one or another view of the conduct of life in a larger philosophical or theological narrative. There is now in the world a contest between two secular moral visions. Let's call one of them the ethic of self-construction or of nonconformity. And it had its ideologists, its philosophers, like Emerson and Nietzsche. And the idea is life is the supreme good, and to come fully into the possession of life, we have to rebel against the script that society imposes on us. And it is only through this struggle that we awaken and come into the possession of the supreme good. In its early or uncorrected form, it often seems to be a kind of radical individualism. Each individual like a little Napoleon who crowns himself. And it seems to misrepresent the relation between self-construction and solidarity. No one rescues himself by himself. And its ideal of autonomy seems to be empty. Each person becomes like Lear, says, I shall do such things, yet I know not what they are, but they will be the terrors of the earth. The content of autonomy derives from our particular engagements and connections. And so the view has to be expanded. To have a stronger claim on our attention, this view would have to be corrected, to be purged of this defect, to no longer just be a simple radical individualism committed to an empty ideal of autonomy. The other ethic, the opposing ethic, is what you could describe as an ethic of connection. And its central idea is that the point of departure of moral experience is not the isolated ego, the individual agent, but the interpersonal. You and me together. Joint intentionality. So it's neither the isolated individual on the one side, nor society and the state on the other. It's the logic of interaction, of the interpersonal, of reciprocity, extending outward in concentric circles to the whole of our experience. And if anything is sacred in the world, according to that view, it is the interpersonal that is sacred. And the classical formulation of this view is in the teachings of Confucius. Now, that view, as well in its uncorrected form, suffers from a defect that limits its claim on our attention. It is ambivalent or ambiguous about the relation of this logic of solidarity or interpersonal reciprocity to the actual organization of society. What is the object? Is the object to spiritualize and humanize the established division of labor, the system of roles in society? Or does it require a fundamental transformation of the arrangements of society? It becomes a more powerful view to the contemporary imagination to the extent that it ceases to accept this template of the established arrangements of society. And then we have these two views, the corrected versions of each view. And we have to work to correct them so that the contest between them not be a contest of straw men, but a contest between each view in its strongest possible form. Now, it's natural for us to think, and here I anticipate a particular controversial position in our arguments, that these two views could somehow be synthesized. But there is some reason to believe that even after they were corrected along the lines that I just anticipated, they would still be different. And in some ways, they would be even more different after they were corrected, because the profound differences between them would shine more clearly. And how would they be different, even after corrected? They would be different, it seems, in the following ways. First, they have different points of departure. The point of departure of the ethic of self-construction is the embodied individual agent, obscure to himself and to other people. The philosopher Heraclitus said, the soul of another person is a dark continent that can never be visited. The point of departure of the corrected ethic of connection is the relation between me and you. The fundamental experience of joint intentionality, of engagement with the other. A second difference is that the ethic of conformity has what you might call a non-finitistic view of the human personality. So the most important feature of the human being is that there is more in him than there is and can be in all the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. These worlds are finite with respect to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. We all individually and all of us collectively, the human race, have more powers of vision, of experience, of invention than any structure can countenance. And this is our most important attribute. Now it seems that the other view has what you could call a non-finitistic view of the human personality. The personality develops, but always not just embodied, but situated in context. And if we become bigger, we can become bigger only together. A third contrast between these views has to do with their relation to the revolution of the last few hundred years to which I referred a moment ago. That revolution is inseparable from the history of the ethic of self-construction and nonconformity. There are two sides of the same history. So the ethic of self-construction and nonconformity cannot be indifferent or neutral to the fate of that revolution. But there is no such internal relation between that revolution and the other ethic. From the standpoint of the other ethic, this revolution, this recent revolution, has good sides and bad sides, but it has no intrinsic relation to the ethic. And a fourth difference between these views is that for the first view, the ethic of self-construction, the confrontation with the terrors of human existence, with our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability, is indispensable to our arousal to a higher form of experience. It is only by confronting this reality that we awaken from our slumbers and our conformity and come into the possession of life. But in the other view, the confrontation with those defects may be regarded as a moral luxury that turns us away from one another. So we might say, as Spinoza did, that a wise man thinks about life and not about death. A fifth difference between these views, even after each of them is corrected, has to do with troublemaking and the troublemakers. So for the first view, the idea is that the troublemakers are the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. And the ethic is the paradoxical ethic of looking for trouble rather than staying out of trouble. The defender of the other ethic may be inclined to believe that under the veneer of this romantic idea of troublemaking lies the impulse to self-aggrandizement. Those distinctions do not disappear between these two ethics, even when they are corrected. Now, it happens that in the world today, for various reasons, each of these two ethics is headquartered in one of the major powers of the world. The ethic of self-construction in the United States and the ethic of connection in China. But this is a loose and contingent association, and it also seems that in each of these nations, the other ethic has powerful appeal, so that there can be a radical reversal in the association of these powers with these moral visions. Now, of course, I just referred to a contest of two secular approaches to the conduct of life. And before we address that conflict, we are going to look at two approaches that do ground a view of the conduct of life in a larger narrative: Christianity and Buddhism. Radically different. And yet they have something in common. What they have in common is the belief that our relation to the other people, the progress of our relation to the other people, its elevation to a higher form, is inseparable from our relation to the ultimate source of value and of reality. In the Semitic monotheisms, including Christianity, God, and the narrative of transactions between God and humanity. And in Buddhism, or the speculative monism that was its philosophical basis, it's the one that is timeless under the surface, the superficial and illusory surface of change and distinction. And there, in discussing Buddhism and Christianity, our main concern will be the interplay between theological or metaphysical presuppositions about the ultimate nature of value and reality and the imperative of how to live. Well, there you have a description of our intellectual program from my point of view. Cornell will have a somewhat different take. And at the end, what seems to deserve most emphasis is the point with which I began, the cognitive gap. The whole experience is an experience of the power of reason and of argument to increase the area of light, to develop the reasons that we have to take one or another positions. It's not that we can't reason. We can. And I hope that the whole course will be a demonstration of these powers of reasoning about what's most important. But let's be honest and clear right at the outset. The reasons are inconclusive. To say that they're inconclusive is not the same thing as to say that they're powerless. And that's the circumstance, at least as I see it in these arguments. It is then an attempt to take our lives in our hands and to go up to the frontier of what is almost unthinkable and almost unspeakable.
Mm-hmm. It's always refreshing to hear you. I just want to reflect on his reflections before I give you my concrete reflections. That to have a synoptic vision that gives you a sense of an overall terrain and how parts are connected to one another. It's a synecdochic imagination. Synecdoche, rhetorical trope that has to do with the relation of parts and wholes. And the wholes are always more than the sum of the parts. But you have to be able to keep track of all the parts, how they interact, how they relate to one another. And it's also profoundly dramatic, which is to say it's conflict reflected upon and conflict existentially felt simultaneously. And it's utopian in its end and aim, which is to say it looks at the present as history, the present as reality, dynamic to change, trying to authorize an alternative to that present reality. And that's what you just heard. And why is that so very important? It's very important because, we reside in a neoliberal university that prides itself on this disciplinary division of knowledge connected to cults of professionalism. So the end and aim is to not just specialize early, but professionalize quick to gain access to success. It may have nothing to do with moral and spiritual greatness. You just want to be successful. You want to be smart, not necessarily wise. Clever, not necessarily courageous. Cunning, not necessarily full of integrity. So that the very intellectual mode of engaging the world is actually, it's a sign and symptom of something very deep that has to do with our present grim and bleak moment of escalating neo-fascisms, of militarisms, of markets out of control, of nations tied to wars, ... So we begin with what Antonio Gramsci called a historical self-inventory. How do we situate and locate ourselves candidly and critically in relation to a variety of forces, some of which we don't even get a chance to reflect upon? I mean, one of the reasons why I began with Chekhov, like Shakespeare, like Sophocles, like Toni Morrison, like Virginia Woolf, like Marquez, they refuse to reduce the catastrophic to the problematic. You're not dealing with problems. If you want to study problems, go to the Kennedy School. If you want to wrestle with technical challenges, stay here at the law school. It will sharpen and narrow your mind, as Edmund Burke said of lawyers. Not all the lawyers, not all law professors, but you got to be rhetorically challenging in order to make your point. What is hegemonic in these neoliberal sites of higher education at this particular moment in the American Empire? Boy, that was not just a Freudian slip, was it? Edward Gibbon, thank you, thank you. At this particular moment in the U.S. empire, with all of its collapse of integrity, honesty, decency, generosity, greed, power, avarice, hatred, contempt, escalating every day. What is distinctive about what Brother Roberto just put forward is the ways in which, if we're going to try to create some space that is inside the neoliberal university, but also critical of it, not demonizing it, it provides a space, but not being seduced by the worst of it, then we've got to be able to always connect the existential and the economic, the social and the spiritual, the personal and the political, the visual and the visionary simultaneously, the theoretical and the practical. It's not going to be just a matter of what you can chatter to make yourself feel smart and approved in the profession, but what kind of life are you really willing to live? And three of the pillars of so much of the cult of professionalism these days is very much conformity, complacency, and often downright cowardliness. To succeed is oftentimes to become so smart and well adjusted to the unjust status quo, become so well adapted to the indifference to the catastrophes around us, beginning with the very land upon which we reside at this very moment with the Massachusetts indigenous peoples and so forth. The ways in which we can silence that, evade that. But Malcolm X said right here at law school in 1963, chickens come home to roost. And they come home to roost psychically, existentially, as well as politically, economically, and with empires. So part of our challenge is precisely to come to terms with our mortality, our insatiability, our groundlessness. What are what the great William James called the stubborn facts, the unavoidable and inescapable facts of death of various kinds, dogmas of various kinds, domination of various kinds. We do not know a moment in the history of the species where any individual in the species has not wrestled with the fact that you're physically going to die, or social death of slavery and enslavement, be the Russian serfs, be the African slaves or whatever, or of civic death. Look, it happens right now all around the world. People who reside in the society but are rendered civically dead, dragged to jail. The journalists trying to engage in critique, no longer having rights relative to that public space, but still civically involved, or like Jim Crow and Jane Crow in America. Black people are part of the body politic, but civically dead. No rights that folks need respect. Or psychically dead, unable to muster the wherewithal, the sources for self-confidence, for self-respect, for self-esteem, forms of affirmation that can allow you to keep keeping on, in the language of Curtis Mayfield. And then spiritual death, where you just completely give up. You cave in, even when your medication is working. You still want to give up. And I'm not speaking autobiographically, because I just hold out on Jesus and cognac, but that's the footnote. You just cave in, or you sell out. That's a form of spiritual death. And you discover it as you get older and older and older. So that any way of being in the world that is death denying and death ducking and death dodging is a sign of spiritual immaturity. It's a refusal to want to wrestle with a stubborn fact of the various forms of death. Same is true with dogma, not just religious dogma, ideological dogma, professional dogma, various nationalist dogmas. Dogma comes in a number of different forms. In fact, even the very notion of thinking that you are not dogmatic itself can become dogmatic. Because death is inescapable. Some form of dogma, in part, is going to be operating, even if it's the anti-dogma of dogmatism. Same is true with domination. Empire, that's where we really ought to start, but nobody really oftentimes wants to start there. No, we're just a democracy with a deficit, slavery. Quit lying. Empire before democracy. Indigenous peoples' land dispossessed before democracy. Slavery was America's original sin. Get off the crack pipe. That's the second one. But it's not just empire. It's predatory forms of capitalism. There will later be repressive forms of communism. It's vicious forms of patriarchy. Ugly forms of homophobia, transphobia. Institutionalized form of the hatred of Muslims, of Jews, of Arabs, of Palestinians, and Dalits, and so forth and so on. All these different forms of domination. And how then do we engage in a wrestling with the conduct of life when you got to deal simultaneously with all these registers? You see. Now, one of the ironies of dealing with forms of death, and here we go back to the Greeks, we're unable to wrestle with our pagan brothers and sisters like Socrates or Sappho, but they're going to be presupposed because we want a whole lot of Socratic energy in this class. And so Socratic energy is learning how to die in order to learn how to live. Because when you learn how to die, you must have the courage to critically examine the forms of dogma that has been inculcated in you, your assumptions and presuppositions. And when you let some of those assumptions and presuppositions go, that's a form of death. That's why Plato said philosophy, love of wisdom, is a meditation on and a preparation for death. He wasn't just talking about physical death. There is no life without death. There's no maturation without death. There's no growth without death. To be obsessed with veritas, truth, the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. You must learn how to die. And the critique of any institution, including Harvard, Harvard had to try to learn how to die in order for black people to get here. Kill that white supremacy. Ooh, we still got a whole lot of work on that one. Kill that male supremacy. Got a whole lot of work on that one. Kill that vicious anti-Jewish quota. Got a challenges still. How you going to come to terms with the new Arabs who are more and more present, the Africans from various parts, the Caribbeans and so forth. The process of learning how to die is endless, it's perennial, but it requires something that is distinctive that often you don't get in neoliberal university, which is a wholesale courage. Because to be courageous can render you so nonconformist that you don't fit. And if you don't fit, you're not going to gain the mainstream pat on the back. If you don't get the mainstream pat on the back, you're going to have less cash flow in your pocket. Can't make it to that vanilla suburb with that mansion that you really dreamed about when you got here. I'm not talking about you all, but I'm talking about some students out there somewhere. Existential issues tied to structural and institutional ones. And so the challenge then becomes, how then do we provide countervailing forces against the forms of death? Well, that's the desire, that's the insatiability. There's a whole lot of talk these days about identity politics, identity politics. Let us be very clear. Every human being born in mama's womb on their way to the tomb has a struggle for identity, because every human being has a deep desire for protection. You're going to have protection in order to make it. You're going to have association. You're going to have people who want to be with you. You're going to have some sense of belonging, some community, some Gemeinschaft. And you're going to have recognition. You want some significance in your short trek from birth to bodily extinction. The great moment of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Tell Godot you saw us. The fulfillment. We all want to be seen in our naked humanity, not our superficial mask that we wear. Baldwin used to say, what love forces us to take off the mask we know we cannot live within, but fear we cannot live without. Take off that mask. Be seen, not viewed. That's at your funeral. Everybody gonna be viewing you. Ooh, Lord, what a life, what a life. Too late. Seen when you're part of the quick. When you're still alive, you're still breathing in that sense. So when we talk about identity, Identity politics. What are the conditions under which this particular slice of humanity feel protected? What are conditions under which they feel associated with in a positive way? What are conditions under which they're really recognized, acknowledged for who they are, not the category, not the label, not the larger abstract conception of the group that they're a part of in all of their distinctive singular individuality and personality. And then there is dialogue. This is again the pagans, this is the Greeks, this is Sophocles, Pytho, over force, persuasion, conversation, polyphonic, sonic relation like jazz. Voices bouncing up against each other. That's forms of rich dialogue in the face of what? Dogma. It unsettles dogma. We recognize every dogma has a history. If every dogma has a history, there must be some contingency to it. And if there's some contingency to it, maybe it can change. Maybe it can be recast in such a way that it's more enabling, that it's more elevating, that it's more empowering in that way. Dialogue, conversation, polyphonic, multi-voiced relation. We're not talking about narrow, monolithic transaction. No, that's market-driven. And let us be very clear. The major forces on the globe right now are markets dominated by oligopolies and monopolies, and nation states with a monopoly of instrumentalities of violence. So all the other talks are crucial, but it's in relation to those two dominant ones. You see. And of course, neoliberal universities are asked to produce the smartest, not necessarily the wisest and the most courageous. That's why universities have never been the vanguard of social movements for freedom and justice. You got to bring them in kicking and screaming. You got people in the street turning things over. I think we've got a Negro problem. There's 212 rebellions. Brother Martin has just got shot. I think we need to have a special cabinet meeting. You don't say. That's been the dominant responses of neoliberal, liberal institutions at the top, given all of the rich humanity that's up there. We're not dehumanizing anybody, you see. And we're not going to romanticize the folk on the block. They got gangster proclivities just like those in Massachusetts Hall. Human beings like anybody else. And all of us have gangster proclivities in that regard, you see. But the problem becomes then, how do we educate our desire in such a way that our desires for protection and association and recognition connected to Pytho, to persuasion, to dialogue, to conversation, to polyphonic exchanges with the end and aim of empowering everyday people. Democracy in the face of domination. So that the conduct of life with all of these different dimensions and facets and aspects, you see, filtered through us in all of their unique ways, given our own uniqueness, is very much what we're going to try to wrestle with in relation to some of these canonical texts. Now, my own wrestle with Brother Roberto that we have such a good time with is that, you see, I come from a particular people. Where's my chalk? We don't have no chalk here. I got my finger. No, that's not happening either. What else are I talking about? You got, oh, thank you so much, my brother. You just pull that out of thin air? Yeah. Hey, that's nice. I appreciate that. I come from a people of a tradition where kenosis, how do you find your voice in such a way that you can empty yourself, donate yourself, offer yourself, sacrifice yourself, serve others with the gifts that you have as a self to empower others? That's where the blues and jazz come from. That's what Martin King is about. That's what Fannie Lou Hamer is about. Martin Luther King Jr. was buried, 39 years old. They said he had the body of a 65-year-old man. When Charlie Parker was buried, he had the body of a 63-year-old man. When Coltrane was buried, 40 years old, he had the body of a 72-year-old man. He gave everything. Like the end of a James Brown concert. You can't walk. because you have given everything. Same would be true for somebody like a Benjamin Davis out of this institution, the leading black communist in the 20th century. The first black man elected to the city council from Harlem was taken to jail, elected in his cell under the Smith Act, incarcerated, Harvard Law graduate. Ben Davis gave it all. He might not be known. Who cares? You keep attracting sometimes the wrong people. Don't get caught with the wrong celebrities who are more spectacle and image rather than kenotic. My dear brother Prince was an exemplar of kenosis. Traveled all over the world with him, never saw the brother sleep. One time I said, you got to get some sleep. I steal away in the afternoon. He's given everything. He got it from James Brown. He got it from Aretha Franklin. He got it from Stevie Wonder. It's a tradition of a people who have been told they have no self-worthy of anything. They cultivate themselves and say, now take this. Take this love in the face of this hatred, this love of truth, this love of goodness, this love of beauty, this love of God in the face of all of this white supremacist hatred. And it's tied to a movement, which is to say, energy. It's energy or despair. It's kinetic. You see it in hip hop. It's the movement of words. But all that rich spirituality and physicality at work. And I'm not saying every black person has this. I'm saying this is a particular tradition created by folk who are wrestling with various forms of death and dogma, white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobic dogmas, capitalist predatory forms of dogma, imperial dogma, and wrestling with forms of domination, you see. And the question becomes, it's very clear, given the crisis of the U.S. empire, and the escalating neo-fascism in the White House and Hungary and Brazil and Turkey, so many other places, India and what have you, how do you have a conception of how to live and why live such that the energy and movement in your own individual life, later on connected to social movements, can exemplify something bigger than the values of just one's narrow professional orientation? So integrity, honesty, decency is a spiritual and moral register. It's deeper than professional register. They may overlap. There are professionals who have great integrity. But the higher they get, the more power they have become addicted to. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't care what color you are. Skin pigmentation is not a function of your moral and intellectual formation. Gender either, sexual orientation either. You're a human being, have to make choices. And what is distinctive about this kind of energy and movement to try to create some meaning in the face of Chronos. Chronos is the time that is colonized by the market. And Kairos is the meaning-infused moments. It's not the moments of narrow joy, it's the moments of narrow pleasure, it's the moment of high joy. And you find joy in living a life that is highly energetic, always on the move, hope itself as much a verb as a virtue. Hope is in the motion, it's in the movement, it's in your energy. It's a refusal to defer to the despair. Now, what sits at the center of this, and let us be very honest, and we're going to be wrestling with this, is nihilism. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel gave a powerful lecture at Union Theological Seminary in 1965 called No Religion is an Island. He was speaking to a variety of different representatives of religion. He said, let us be very clear, the major ecumenical movement on the globe is nihilism. Don't just tell me about your Christianity, your Islam, your Judaism, your Buddhism. No, nihilism, and it's shot through all of those religions in their dominant form. And nihilism is not this nice little fancy talk about meaninglessness as you sip your tea at some fashionable cafe on the left bank of Paris or in London or in Buenos Aires or in Lagos or in Cambridge. Nihilism is Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. Might makes right. Power determines what is moral. Naked strength defines what ethical insight is. It is the elimination of the moral and spiritual dimensions. It's all about naked power. He or she who has the power dictates. The worship of the golden calf, the conception of the golden rule in which not do unto others as you would have others to do unto you, but he or she who has the goal will rule. Very different. You see. And Rabbi Heschel is right. That was 1965. 2020, various forms of nihilism. It could take neoliberal versions. Nice little progressive chit-chat during elections, and as soon as you win, you're right back in the lap of Wall Street, right back in the lap of militarism, right back into dropping the drones on folk who are invisible in Somalia and Libya and Afghanistan as if their lives don't make a difference. But when you kill one American, you get a press conference overnight, they get economic compensation for the rest of their lives, and you apologize even though you had said drones are not killing innocent folk. How do you become so comfortable with evil and then want to lie about it and live a lie? That's a fashionable form of nihilism. Now, it's true to the neo-Nazi brothers and sisters, they just raw about it. I can't stand y'all. I want to kill you. You say, appreciate the honesty. And that's what we had in Charlottesville when they were right up in front. It was really something. It was interesting, though, how even the neo-Nazi groups we walked by in the park would listen to Motown music. Isn't that something? Oh, that's America, isn't it? I run into David Duke. I said, but the Klan was founded hating black people, Jews, and Catholics. You Catholic. Yeah, this is upward mobility American style. I'm head of the Klan now. I'm Catholic. Human beings making choices. Conduct of life. What kind of life does one live? And coming out of a tradition in which one is on intimate terms with form of nihilism. And I was just talking about some of the negative form. There is a positive form of nihilism that I'm going to trot out here. It's very controversial. But I think there's something to it. You know, it was a wonderful moment in George Eliot's Middlemarch when she says, one of the reasons why we do have dogmas is that if in fact we could really see thoroughly just how grim and bleak things are. She says, if we could see the grass grow and hear the grass grow, hear the squirrel's heartbeat, we would die from the roar that lies on the other side of silence. That's what T.S. Eliot means when he says, we can only stand so much reality. You can't stand at your mama's coffin for a whole day. You're gonna snap. That's what happened to Ralph Emerson when his baby died. He would walk all the way from Concord to Roxbury. And then one day, he got in the coffin with the baby. And his partner said, Ralph, you're going too far, man. You're gonna snap. You can only bear so much reality. You need some distance. You need some music. You need some Rembrandt. Because Rembrandt is kenosis on the canvas, but that's just a Dutch footnote. But oh, he's the greatest one of them all. Given his whole self on the canvas to bring out the rich humanity of the folk that he's depicting, no matter who they are. That's that deep human connection that comes out of my own tradition, you see. So that when I went to vacation Bible school and my teacher told me, little Cornell, if the kingdom of God is within you and everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. I said, And you leave heaven behind by raising a lot of hell on earth. Because if you're concerned about truth and allowing all the suffering to speak, if you're nonconformist and in the world but not of it, if you're really concerned about tenderness, kindness, and sweetness, as well as love and justice, you're going to be a troublemaker. But it's simply a way of trying to engage in a conduct of life rooted in a tradition that has been critically discerned, unleashing Socratic energy, but a Socratic energy that also is tied, and I'll bring this to a close, we're going to open it up, to tears. And I think this is very important. I really do. It has everything to do with the vulnerability and the invincibility and the sense of openness that Brother Roberto was talking about. We know that Socrates never cried, he never shed a tear, which means he loved wisdom, but he never loved anybody. You can't love somebody intensely and not shed tears, not just at their funeral, even during the relationship. Tears of joy and tears of sorrow. And part of the genius of Hebrew scripture is it begins with cries and tears. So it has something to do with shattering numbness and callousness. It's something shattering the indifference, because the tears allow our vulnerability to be manifest. Then the question becomes, how do you transform the source of those tears into sonic expression, music, intellectual expression, stories, narrative, arguments, but rooted in something bigger than just the stories and the arguments and the narratives, rooted into the human suffering and shuddering that takes place in light of one's own insecurities and anxieties, in light of one's own fears. And so what we want to keep track in this class is that kind of dialectical interplay between the Socratic energy on the one hand and the prophetic legacies of Jerusalem that are tied to tears with hypersensitivity to the suffering of the orphan and the widow and the nameless and the fatherless and the motherless and the poor and so forth and so on. And these are moral and spiritual issues that have profound political consequences. But you don't begin with just the politics. You begin with a certain conception of what it means to be human, and then recognize the deep flaws and recognize the deep challenges that Roberto was rightly and so eloquently putting forward. But let's open it up. We got good time. We got a good half hour for questions. Oh, no, you and I should talk a little bit, though, huh? What do you think? Is it all right? Is it open up? Absolutely. Yeah, yes, my brother.
Can I ask a question to Professor Unger?
Absolutely.
I'd like you to respond to what Professor Unger just said about kind of source, which transcends all the things that we could say about it. It seems like it's the kind of thing, it's an expression of brokenness that lies at the bottom of these conceptual structures, these ways of looking and framing at the problem, the first order problem. Tears being a source of that. How does that kind of transmute into your language?
Well, first I associated in general with the central role of vulnerability and the heightening of vulnerability in our ascent to a higher form of experience. So, especially in the first of those two ethics that I described, the ethic of self-construction and nonconformity, uncorrected or corrected, we think that we come into the possession of life only by paying a price. And the price is the heightening of vulnerability. And vulnerability means sorrow. So it's not just that we attempt to confront without illusion our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. It's that we look for trouble. We engage in this struggle to transform ourselves by transforming the world. And the price is to become vulnerable. Now, this is in direct contradiction to an idea of moral wisdom that was common in the philosophy of the Greeks, which is that through philosophical education, we become more serene. And we become impervious to disappointment and rebuff. A fortress against the misfortunes of the world. So this is a direct conflict of two visions.
Do we or do we not accept serenity as an ideal? Or do we commit ourselves to pay the price of vulnerability? Now, the problem of tears is also connected directly to the question whether the organizing principle of our moral experience in relation to others is altruism or love. Altruism and love are not the same thing. So the perspective of the academic meta-ethics that we'll discuss next week is the perspective of this legalistic and universalistic altruism. Altruism and love differ on 4 dimensions at least. So first, the object in altruism is subordinating our selfishness or self-centeredness to the needs of the other. The object in love is our fundamental reconciliation with the other person. There is a contradiction in the conditions of our self-assertion. To develop the self, we have to connect to the others. Every connection threatens us with loss of personal distinction and of freedom. Every connection threatens us with subjugation. To be free, we have to be able to connect without losing ourselves. And we have that experience in love. Now, second, altruism, although it may require sacrifice, and even the sacrifice of life itself, imposes no inner jeopardy. Love supposes equality. Love can be rebuffed. It can fail. It can be defeated. And this jeopardy is another way of talking about tears. And that then relates to the third difference between altruism and love, which altruism is, as it were, a gift from on high, from a distance. Love requires a plane of equality, whatever the difference in social station. And then fourth, in altruism, there is no cognitive or epistemological problem. There's the practical problem of the subordination of selfishness. In love, there is an epistemological threshold, the ability to imagine the other, the otherness of the other person. The other is obscure. And love is not love if the other is simply a projection of our own self. So those 4 differences are 4 dimensions of tears, of vulnerability. And it's a different conception of life. It's a conception of life in which we come to think that in order to ascend to a higher form of experience, we have to throw down our shields. And that's very hard. And it's a direct subversion of what has been a central ideal of the moral life in many traditions.
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I would say tears of sorrow are the holy water of the brokenhearted. There's a song by Jimmy Ruffin out of Motown. He's the brother of David Russell, lead singer of the Temptations. What becomes of the brokenhearted? The saddest song ever produced by the American machine of popular music, namely Motown. Crossover for Vanilla Brothers and Sisters, coming out of chocolate side of town. And what Brother Unger is saying is captured by that song in a very powerful way. But the irony is one is most human sometimes when your heart is broken. See, that's Tennyson writing about his friend and his former memory, you see. Or that's Sondheim's at the end of Company, somebody who doesn't want to fall in love, but he don't want to really be alive too much because there's too much vulnerability required. And here comes Sondheim laying that out, Bing. I wish I could sing. We'd have some serious Sondheim moments here, because Sondheim understands these tears at this deep, grim, bleak level in the genre of musical theater. Yes.
So what do you do when there's this?
Louder.
What do you do when there's this like this prevalent sense of complacency and satisfaction with that, and even a degree of security
Yes.
that's evident when complacency allows you to just kind of maintain the status quo, and then you have like maybe this pocket or this niche of progressive or intellectual agitation that would serve to kind of move the society as a whole, but then there's still like this great degree of complacency that just keeps things right where they are in spite of the need or the pain or the suffering.
Oof, that is a $60,000 question. I'm telling you, I'm on the plane tonight to Iowa trying to wrestle with that question with Brother Bernie. You know what I mean? To speak to fellow citizens and say that your relative prosperity or your insecurity is spoken to most clearly by some of the things you think you fear, which is a certain kind of vision of the world. You see, which is put progressive inverted commas for let's say Brother Bernie, because he's very progressive, but we could argue about left, liberal, and so forth. But for folks who are both hurting but highly reluctant to want to be open to various kinds of movements that are taking place, that are trying to exemplify both a sensitivity to them, but also associated with some folk these folk not used to being associated with. Peoples of color, and women, and so forth and so on. Gays and lesbians and trans, and so on. That's a challenge. That's how, in fact, one has to proceed wisely, tenaciously, in terms of exemplifying in one's own action a possibility of solidarity. Because that's the only thing we human beings can do. It's only by example that you can convince people that they can trust you with what they understand to be a chance of them being able to live a better life. And not just a better life materially. People are not just material beings. They want to live a better life in community. They want to live a better life in terms of health and connection with other people and so forth. And that's a very crucial contextual question. It's going to be context by context, state by state, country by country, planet, what the ecological catastrophe impending every day. What kinds of examples, so we can convince people who are complacent. Now you got some folk who are just greedy. They know exactly what's going on. That's the nihilistic folk of the first sort. They know exactly what's going on. They're just greedy, short-term, myopic, concerned about themselves, and could give a damn about other folk. And that's a human thing. That's inside of all of us, I think. We have to reconquer it every day. But does that begin to get at your question?
So I just want to add to that, because speaking, and here we're anticipating later arguments in the course, and speaking especially from the standpoint of an attempt to reshape that first approach of self-construction and nonconformity. There are two sides to the problem of conformity, of complacency. One side has to do with the relation of the self to the social world. And the other side has to do with the relation of the self to itself. So with respect to the social world, the problem is this. To be free to come into the possession of life, we have to engage in a particular world. No one can be free outside a world. But every world seems to exact from us as the condition of our engagement that we surrender to it and give it the last word, that we become its puppets. And that's one aspect of complacency, this resignation to the world, in which we violate the commandment to be in the world without being of it. So the question is,
That's a biblical commandment, isn't it?
yes, a biblical
Oh, I
commandment.
just wanted to note that.
So the question is, how can we engage in a world without surrendering to it? How can we
Yes, yes.
be insiders and outsiders at the same time?
Yes, yes.
Now, that question has a political side and a personal side. So the political side is the reshaping of institutions in such a way that they facilitate their own transformation and allow the participants to be insiders and outsiders. But that project, if it goes forward at all, goes forward only in historical time. And we don't live in historical time, we live in biographical time. And St. Augustine says all ages are equidistant from eternity, but we don't get to choose the age of history in which our lives take place. So now, for example, we're living in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. And the question is whether we should accept the biases and preconceptions of that counter-revolutionary interlude as if they could control us or resist them. And so that's one side of the problem of complacency. If the problem has not been resolved politically, it can only be resolved personally. And if the institutions are not yet reorganized, we have to find a way to conduct our lives in the spirit of being insiders and outsiders at the same time. The less political progress there is, the greater the burden on personal virtue and rebellion. Now, there's a second side to the problem of complacency that has to do with the relation of the self to the self. As we grow older, a carapace of routine and compromise begins to form around each of us. The rigidified form of the self, the character, the Greeks said character is destiny, and the social circumstance to which we're resigned. The rigidified self married to the circumstance. This is the mummy. And within this mummy, each of us begins to die little by little, many small deaths. And that's another definition of complacency. The acceptance of these small deaths. And what then do we want? We want to break out of this mummy at the price of a heightened vulnerability, so that we can live in such a way that we die only once.
Look here and then, but any hands in the back, I just want to jump right in.
Was you mentioned that Socrates never cried?
Yeah.
That's because he loved wisdom and never loved people. And to my knowledge, in the Old and New Testament, the Abrahamic prophets, they never laughed. And I'm thinking about it in the context of the Prophet Muhammad. There's only really one example of him laughing. And it tells a story, it doesn't really actually tell why he laughed. It tells a story of, there was a man who used to drink alcohol, which isn't allowed in Islam, and he would constantly come to the Prophet for repentance. And this man was someone who used to make the Prophet laugh a lot. But it doesn't tell why, why he would make the Prophet laugh. So it's a very, kind of secondary mention. It's not like a primary mention. But I guess the question is, what does it say about the Abrahamic prophets that they cry but they don't laugh, and the Greek philosophers they don't cry? And then what does it say about the Abrahamic religious traditions that sort of are this marrying of Greek philosophy and Abrahamic prophecy that give us people like Maimonides, like Avicenna, like Saint Augustine, all these sort of people?
Yeah, no, did you all hear the question in the back about the laughing and crying? I won't say too much, but it's very important. But you want to take a look at Thomas More's dialogues on tribulation. That's his question. Why does Socrates never cry? Why does Jesus never laugh? Now, Jesus does say in Luke 21, they who weep now shall laugh. So you get laugh in the biblical text in the Koine Greek. And of course, Isaac means laughter in Hebrew, vis-a-vis Sarah and older and what have you. But even laughter, all of these concepts have to be viewed through Wittgensteinian lens, which is to say they have a number of different meanings. Laughter can mean, as Hobbes said, sudden glory, which you laugh at somebody who is disadvantaged. You see somebody going off a cliff, and you know they're going off and they're going to break their neck, but we laugh anyway. That's the history of cartoons in a way, growing up, right? So laughter can mean sudden glory. In that sense, it generates a coldness inside of you. See, one of the reasons why Jesus doesn't laugh is because he's so thoroughly identified with the suffering of Jerusalem and Lazarus. Everywhere he goes, somebody touch me. He's so identified with suffering that he doesn't want the Hobbesian conception of looking at somebody and then moving away. He doesn't want that kind of distance. But there's other conceptions of laughter, too. There's incongruity.
Exactly.
Absolutely. That's a much richer and deeper one. Back
So-
to Chekhov again. We got our Russian brother. Just got a PhD in Russian literature. Y'all lucky that we're lucky to have this brother here. A lot of different reasons, but that's one. But so that incongruity, well, that's a different kind of laughter. But sometimes incongruity is not funny. See, Kafka is a comic writer, but it's not too funny when you get into Gregor Samsa after that first line. You see, there's a different kind of level of comedy operating here. And it also be relief. It could be catharsis. You see, that's Freud. So there's different conceptions of laughter in this regard. Usually, for the prophets, they're thinking of glory, condescension, arrogance, shatter that in the name of sensitivity to the suffering. See, that's much more Amos, Jeremiah, Esther in the Judaic tradition. But so that when we talk about this, there's different conceptions of laughter that's operating here. Probably the
Incongruity is a foretaste of transcendence.
Oh, yes.
That we don't fit.
That's right. And it's perennial.
And that's a principle
It's
of
endless.
laughter.
Absolutely.
And it's because of this inappropriateness of the circumstances of our fortunes to our natures that we also cry. So this sense of not fitting and renouncing the search for serenity and accepting the fate of incongruity and the task of transcendence is a different view from pagan wisdom. And that has had immense power in these world religions.
That's right.
And especially in the Semitic religions, in the religions of the Bible, the Semitic monotheisms.
And one last point, you see, with Shakespeare, as you like it, Rosalind, who was probably the richest, deepest exemplar of what it is to be human. She begins with mirth. Sir John Falstaff, Henry IV, Prince Hal, he is laughing all the time. Give me life, give me life. Drunk half the time, that's all right, give me life. Lustful most of the time, I'm not sure that's all right, but it's too manipulative and patriarchal, but we understand he's trying to wrestle with getting outside himself. He's just got toxic and tyrannical masculinity like most brothers in late capitalist society. They don't know how to really get out of themselves without some sense of conquest and domination and manipulation. You see. But so that laughter becomes a way of subordinating, which is ugly. We saw that in the Kavanaugh hearings when the sister said, the worst moment was when he laughed at me. You see, that's a level of existential attack and humiliation with laughter. So you said laughter could be negative, it can be positive relative to the context here. But this is one of the reasons why we need a variety of voices. Same would be true in jazz. Mingus is a poet of laughter with his bass in jazz. It's hard to be a comic jazz person, but it's there. But they relate to each other in that regard. So these voices are something that we need. In Islam, I don't know enough in order to say anything with insight, and I appreciate you providing some insight in this regard. But the same kind of dynamic, my hunch, is at work because it is one of the great exemplars of the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem too, in all of his best and all of his worst. Tied to domination, tied to conceptions of liberation that can bring critique to bear. Was the question right here? Yes.
So can we say either of these opposing views that we're going to be exploring to re-sanctify nature, or are we stuck in this kind of anthropocentric domination?
Wonderful question.
You speak first.
Oh no, no,
Because we may
got
have
to.
we may have different views about
Yeah,
that.
absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
depending on what
I
you mean
think we
by
need
the
an I-thou
sanctification of
relation to
nature,
nature.
but I would say, depending on what you mean by sanctification, that sanctification would be on these would be a perversion, a spiritual perversion. Nature should not be sanctified. One thing is to preserve it, to respect it, to value it, but not sanctified. It has no divine character. It is true that life is in nature, and the attributes of life are that it exceeds any structure, that it has the ability to moderate the force of path dependency, ability to surprise, spontaneity. And we see those characteristics that we value spiritually foreshadowed in life and therefore in nature, but that's not the same thing as sanctifying nature. But it's an ideal of how to be. So one American philosopher, Santayana, said of another American philosopher, William James, he was so extremely natural that there was no way of knowing what his nature was or what came next. And that's this ideal, that we transcend the structure and are capable of giving surprise and of surprising ourselves. And in that view, in that tradition, that becomes one of the highest conceptions of value.
But we're interested in your arguments, whatever they are, as relates to forms of sanctification, what you mean by that. Well, how is that different than an I-thou relation with nature, which is not simply one of objectification and domination and so forth? Is a hand way in the back? Yes, go ahead.
How do you reconcile?
Louder, please.
How do you reconcile need for vulnerability with an inability to accept like reality and its suffering? Do you recommend like not living in that realm of sort of objective reality and suffering, or do you find sort of solace within that, in spite of that, or like find some I don't know, some sort of does that is like is objective the suffering within objective reality, do you use that to find some sort of insight into how you should live your life, or do you live your life in such a way that you temper the degree to which you experience that objective reality in order to be as happy as you can be?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is the question about the relation between protection and experimentation requiring vulnerability?
It relates to kind of what Dr. West was saying about Emerson and how when he consistently would visit his child who had passed away, he was on the verge of snapping, and that in order to cope with that, he withdrew. And
Yes.
I was wondering if that would be like indicative of how you should generally behave with respect to like extreme suffering like that, or if an alternative approach is like what you were saying, vulnerability, being vulnerable to that suffering and try to use that in some way to like.
Because the degree of suffering might overwhelm you.
Yes.
Well, yes. So think, for example, of the relation of a parent to a child, the love that a parent gives to the child. The parent says to the child, I love you unconditionally. And this is a kind of haven. And then on that basis, go out and raise a storm in the world. So we think that the individual should have a haven, Now, personally, it can be love. Politically, it can be fundamental rights, a haven of vital protected interests, immunities, and capability assuring endowments. But the reverse side of that haven of security should be then the storm. So, in the liberal discourse of fundamental rights, we have the part about the haven, but where's the part about the storm? Because that's the other part. That the sense of security is for the sake of this ability to experiment. So the individual is then like the seraph Abdiel in Milton's Paradise Lost, unshaken, unseduced, unterrified, so that he can then struggle, not just with society, but with himself. So it is true that in the larger moral narrative in this tradition, there's a relation, a dialectical relation between protection and unprotection. The individual should be protected and protect himself so that he can then unprotect himself outside of that haven. And we think that that's then how we ascend to a higher form of experience. But your question suggests that the single-minded focus on vulnerability is too narrow, personally and politically. And we have to have this larger view of the relation between protection and unprotection.
And association and friends and family who can intervene, because no one of us are ever fully in control. Just a little fully in control, you know what I mean? And it's going to be from context to context to context. The closest person in my whole life is my brother. I'm just half 1/3 the person he is. If I live long enough to see him in the grave, I'm liable to jump in there with him, just like Ralph. So I better have some partners around. Oh, no, Corn. This is not a good decision at the moment. We holding you back. I said, no, I got to go. My brother's gone, I'm gone. I lived a good life. Now you still got a little work to do. So my partners pull me out. And when I get back to my Jesus and cognac, I say, I'm glad you did. Because my brother wouldn't want me in there. But the thing is, you're overwhelmed. There's nothing wrong with being overwhelmed. This is beyond the Socratic ideal of self-control and self-mastery. There's moments in which self-mastery is not impressive. You got to learn how to surrender yourself, like falling in love with somebody. Self-mastery is not a virtue if you're going to fall in love. You're just going to have a little low-level relationship. So that the context makes a difference. You see what I mean? But your question is something that's going to come back and haunt us. All these wonderful questions are going to come back and haunt us throughout this class. We got 2 minutes. We got a question. Did we get any sisters that raise questions? I want some gender balance in the question. Did I miss any sisters? Yeah, quick. We got one here, one here. Go right ahead. We're going in with you. We're right here.
This is more a comment than a question. But when I was listening, I was really thinking about the Saint Ramana Maharshi when he was asked about the question of others. He said there are no others, right? And so that idea of there are no others except the ones that we create in our minds through our physical, like material world, institutions, etc. So when I read Conduct of Life in Eastern and Western Philosophy, I was thinking, even though it's painted as a binary, this would be an opportunity to break down that binary and break down those ideologies. So I don't really see what both of you are talking about as opposing views, and that's kind of what I'm hoping that the tone will be, that these may be ideologies that were created in a fixed historical context, but it's really about the ideas and how those ideas serve us in the current context. So just a comment.
No. Your voice be very important in this regard to push us, because we're going to come back, as you can imagine, well, my dear sister, are you saying, in fact, that when you look at me, I'm not really an other in all of my concreticity and facticity, I'm just a projection of your imagination? So what does that mean? Am I an illusion? That's the kind of argument we're gonna have to wrestle with. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
For sure. I mean, I think that's what it is. It's the argument for how do we all become human when we're not right now.
Yeah. In the process of trying to become more compassionate and so forth. Actually, what we gonna, this brother, I promise this brother. Oh, can you wait?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I was literally just gonna ask you pretty much what Molly said. So like,
Oh,
nice to see you
wonderful.
off the break, Molly.
One. Oh, that's good. That's good. No, I appreciate that. Appreciate that.
We have to stop.
Yeah, we
now.
gotta go because I gotta be at 3 o'clock. But so we hope to see you all next week. We'll see, what the room is like. But begin reading the academic moral philosophy and so forth. So,
We have to stop.
Hmm?